Good morning. Welcome back to Ministry Monday. I'm talking about our responsibility to feed the sheep. One person who comments on what I talk about today and another who shares this video on their Facebook page will receive a copy of my book, The Science of Shepherding. Now, it's important for those of you who receive that award to give us your address, otherwise very difficult for us to mail it to you. I want to take that just a little bit further. Last week I used the term percolating, where that we give people something to consider and talk about that or think about that will be part of their life through the rest of the week. I think there's several words that maybe we could draw from agriculture at least. The sheep munch. And I'm using the word munch when I could use the word meditate or contemplate or even cogitate. What happens with the percolator that I talked about before is that repeated cycle makes the coffee stronger. And of course, the objective that we as pastors would have is to do something and offer something that would bring thought and reflection. So how can we get our people to do more of this? Because in many instances, I think that I find myself doing people's thinking for them, and we leave nothing for them to contemplate. Well, what's going to happen when I'm no longer present to think for them? Now, let me give you one idea that may work. It's a little bit more high risk than some of the things like taking your Bible and moving among the audience. By the way, one of our church planners in Texas sent me a note that he had tried that with what he thought was a rather average sermon. And he said he took his Bible, he worked among the audience with Bible in hand, and it was as though the audience was just transfixed, and he did not lose their attention at all. And he said that the message that he perceived as being average suddenly was talked about by his congregation as being something that was very special. Now, what I'm going to talk about now is a little bit more risky than that. An acquaintance was doing a series on the Sermon on the Mount, and the approach he followed was as follows. Number one, he would read the verse or verses aloud, and then he would have the audience read that text aloud with him. By the way, I do this very often, and if the text is a bit longer, I'll often have the audience read alternating verses aloud. And then here's where it gets unusual. After the passage had been read aloud, there were 3 or 4 discussion type questions that were either in handout or they were put on a screen. And the pastor went and sat down for 5 to 7 minutes while the congregation silently read that passage again, and they began to answer the questions that were posed. And of course, the goal was for this to be their mental conversation, not the pastor giving them answers. And then after most of the people had read, the pastor would read the passage aloud for a third time. Now, notice the emphasis here. It's on the Bible. God has magnified his word above his name. What I have to say about his word is not magnified above his name. We need to spend more time with the word. And so after all of this had happened, the pastor would lead the group in a discussion of the questions posed. The observation that he had was that people gain more from what they talk about, from what they're involved in, than from what they hear talked about. It's hard to totally mentally shut down when the person beside you on a pew suddenly is the person doing the talking. It's a different voice. And of course, you do get some off-the-wall stuff, but it's rare, and people in the congregation, as a rule, know when it's off the wall. And through the years, you'll rarely have to confront an error. And eventually, after this had transpired, the pastor would spend a bit of time, obviously a shorter period of time, clarifying the thoughts of the passage. What's the result? Over 10 years later, that pastor will still have people talk about that particular series where he followed that technique. Try it. The goal is to feed the sheep, and the sheep need to be eating consistently and constantly. So take a risk, lead them to a different pasture, give them a time to participate in the very thing that you're hoping that they will learn.